on the disciplinary, religious, and social hegemonies, and discontent with categories that cannot perform both the universal and the particular, from the national or the regional to the questions of movement and displacement. We have 15 minutes for questions. I'm sure there will be some questions. I'll just moderate pictures.
I have questions for you guys.
I have questions. Tons of questions. Anyway, the first one is that in the panels that I've attended, I'm wondering. I mean, I worked a bunch on cartography, and I'm kind of shocked about how nobody talks of south as a cardinal point, as a direction. How south means mostly, it doesn't really mean that, and when it means geography, it means east, or it means west, in the case of Spain, for example. It doesn't mean a direction, but a culture. So why do you call it south? I mean, how is that useful, and how does south, in each of your very distinct disciplines and modes of inquiry, it serves different purposes? And you're all fighting against this categorization of south because it doesn't do something. So I was wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit about how south, as an apparently abstract category that doesn't seem to have any agency, any agenda to it. You know, south seems very scientific, right? It's neutral in a way, but it's not performing anything neutral for you. It's actually obscuring that appearance of scientific discourse or for neutrality. Is in fact hiding a lot of things for you guys. So I was wondering if any of you would want to address that.
It's exactly that. It is a category. It is a way for, at least in Italy, to define yourself against something which you are not. And in a lot of the migrant literature, there is this reference to how all African migrants are called Marocchini, or from Morocco. And there is this, unwillingness to break up the South and make it more specific, and it has become obviously a blanket term for those who are not like us.
I mean, I definitely struggle with it. I struggle to even define what I was saying. You know, I said that I was talking about South in a geopolitical sense. For me, it was difficult because I don't even know if it makes sense, to talk about the North-South divide. You're South, but you're always North for somebody else. So, and I mean, in Italy, it's a big issue for sure. Like it's related to the way Italy was unified. So, after the unification, there is a South impression, which I think is not resolved right now. So, it's a never-ending South impression, and it's not addressed by the political parties too, or addressed in ways that we do not want it to be addressed. But the extreme right saying, we're just going to divide and make a separate state, which is the North. So,
in my case, the concept of South is quite interesting, because the migrants that from Sicily went to Tunisia, they went from south to south. It's quite interesting because normally the Italian immigration was from south to north, from south to western world, United States, more or less. Something that was seen as western, as north, as developed countries. Instead, my subject, my Italian Sicily, went to a colonial country, Tunisia, that was in the south. So it's a double south. In my case, the southerners are in the exception of the Italian system of the southern Italy that was underdeveloped place of northern Italy. So southern as a cultural concept of the social one.
Yeah. certainly not.
Maybe mostly for Benedetta, but I don't know if it's acceptable to extend the questions also to the moderator. It's true that South is not performative, neither is class. It's people who perform. And since you, in the, I don't know who wrote the call for paper, but you began with Gramsci's Southern question, and you're talking about Southern question, and you're talking about Gramsci. And in the Southern question, I mean, the main point is that of an alliance between a group that at that time was supposed to be a subject of history, and other groups, peasants, who were not subjects of anything. So I wonder if South cannot be, if not performative, cannot be a category within which alliances can be constructed and performances would happen.
I think this is a super interesting question because, so for the way we were talking about it, it was some sort of, it was in the negative, you know. We were talking about it in terms of restriction, and now you're talking about alliances, so that's super interesting because I would have never conceived it in that way.
But there was a little bit Franco Piperno's point, and that's a text that is never mentioned in discussions of South and Meridionalismo. The point, I mean, for him it was an argument articulated through the categories of autonomia. And the point was the classical one, alla Salida or alla Cassano, the South has always been defined by someone else, but let's take these definitions and turn them into positive. So laziness can become refusal to work in lingo. And I wonder if South could not do things without making a metaphysics of the South.
It's very interesting. So I was also wondering, because you talked about Italianità, so the notion of Italianità, and you talked about the notion of otherness. So those two notions too, whether, you know, they're negative or positive, you can articulate them in the positive, but then Italianità sort of comprises a number of very different regions and dialects and entities and identities. And so sometimes, you know, because of the way Italy was unified, we say that each has a different identity and you don't want to be confused even within Italy. It's a complicated notion. And otherness is very fascinating because with migrants, so this morning I think Celine was talking about the problem of migrants in France, so like the French people, they're not migrants anymore actually, they're supposedly French, they perceive themselves as foreigners because they're not accepted and there are issues of race, so I think it's a bit the same. It's like they are, maybe they even have the documents to be Italians, but they don't feel Italians. It's a feeling that they don't perceive.
It's also the idea of political indifference of Tarazzara that we can apply to the national indifference seen in minor context of talents.
So I had a sort of a similar question to Montalbano for Pratique, like, or even for Claudia, sorry, again. For the Mediterranean, in the sense that, like, I, from both of your presentation, I got the impression that your, at least, well, your interpretation of what Mediterranean studies, what the Mediterranean per se is doing, is a little bit negative, right? So it's like, at least in your presentation, you were sort of saying how, like, a broader perspective, like a Mediterranean perspective, can lead us to forget maybe all this Spanish contribution to medieval poetry. So, and like, I was wondering, why do you, like, we were talking before about like universalism and particularism, like, why do you see necessarily this intent of Mediterranean studies as like cutting off other, like a more local perspective, in the sense that you were talking about the fact that one of the main intent of a Mediterranean perspective would be at least to include the Arabic, which is usually forgotten. So I was just wondering, like, how does that work in the, maybe I don't know enough in the case of like Spanish or medieval poetry, because I think
Yeah.
at least in the sense that like usually at least for what I know, for instance, troubadouric poetry is more associated with France than with Spain, and so maybe by applying the Mediterranean perspective, you could also say, well, it would be like interesting to bring the Spanish contribution to play, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I understand that perspective. I guess it's the point that mostly the people who do things that they call Mediterranean studies aren't Hispanists, because the Hispanists don't need that label, because they've been doing it for 100 years. I mean, it depends on the person, there are different articulations, and some of the counter-articulations have been politically problematic, to put it politely. But I don't know, I think it's a way for other people to kind of get in on the same conversation, which isn't to say it's not valuable. I think it absolutely is, but it's like all these different discourses have a utility in terms of if they do or don't offer a way to make valuable comparisons. And I think this is one where, in an effort to be sort of more inclusive and to open the perspective, I think you actually lose things that you may not know you're losing if you're not paying more careful attention. So I guess my point is only to, as that pendulum swings the other way, the impulse pushing it is a good one, maybe try to stop it more in the middle than allowing it to go all the way to the other extreme where you lose out on that local particularity. That's a concern.
I think, Enzo.
Very shortly. Well, unfortunately, I couldn't attend the previous sessions of this conference. It seems to me that these notions of Mediterranean studies or South are problematic insofar as they give a geographical connotation to cultural and political questions. Sometimes the South is a notion, or tends to be used as an up-to-date notion for former idea of third world. But it's a different thing. So, when we speak about Spanish medieval literature, its legacy concerns both the Netherlands, the Marrano culture in Europe, or Latin America. So that could be interpreted as an Atlantic or broadly speaking, European notion. And so this notion of South, and perhaps the Gramscian essay on the southern question. So Italy is, to a certain extent, a kind of paradigmatic concept of South. But, well, if we think about the present situation, immigration in Europe, so Italy is the south of Europe, Sicily is the south of Italy, so Sicily at the same time is the north of Africa or the west of Africa. And so I think that the notion of South could be productive if it is considered as a condensation of contradictions. So, and I think that Claudia spoke about the necessity to rethink the concept of borders because of this process of migration, of this conflict between Europe and intra-European countries. So this concept of border is not a geographical concept. So there is a South passing through the European Union. So being sans-papiers or documentados in Italy, in France, in Spain, means to embody this contradiction in Europe. So, I think that perhaps we have to reconceptualize.
Yeah, I was thinking it's very funny how South is not the opposite of North, it's really the opposite of West, you know, in cultural discourse. And I often ask my students if they think Mexico is part of the West. And they often say no. Very often say no. So I'm like, so where does West end? When we talk about Western culture, it's a very North-South, actually, that economy. And I think that is very interesting. Just to end this, I want to recall something that I heard. South means different things for different cultures, for example. South is not necessarily a bad term for me. I don't recognize it only as an American, especially in election time. I recognize it as a bad term. But not as a Mexican. You see, South doesn't mean anything like that to me. And in Latin America, it has very different connotations. I remember once I heard Walter Mignolo speaking of post-colonialism and Orientalism give a talk, and people were questioning, so what do you mean when you talk about South? Where is the South? And Mignolo answered, el sur soy yo. Which I love. Anyway, I'd like to thank this panel, which was excellent, made me think a lot. And let's go with coffee.